For a ship that never saw the water, that was never properly designed, and never even looked at as a proper warship, well, there are few ships as well known as the Ideal Battleship for the Royal Navy, sometimes better known as Cuniberti's battleship, or more jokingly, the battleship that never was. You might recall this video if you're a very long time viewer. I chose to go back and expand upon it today. It's worth remembering as we move forward that despite the reputation of this concept, navies were already looking in similar directions. Various fleets, from Japan to the United States or the Royal Navy, were looking at all big gun warships. How seriously the idea was taken did vary, of course, but it was certainly floating about. For example, the Japanese were already moving towards Satsuma, which, had it not been for gun shortages, might well have been the first all-big gun battleship, and when they were laid down, if not when they were completed. Nonetheless, Cuniberti's article would shape public opinion, and it certainly made navies look closer at the concept as a whole, although his ideal battleship was really quite far from being ideal. It wasn't as revolutionary as dreadnought would become, and in the end, it was more of a concept than any sort of serious design. You'll see this later when we look at the statistics put forward for it. And yet, for all of this, it still comes up in discussion 120 years later, because fundamentally, it was the first time that the idea of a battleship armed with only big guns would enter the public mindset. Satsuma and other early concepts weren't as public for obvious reasons. Even had Dreadnought or South Carolina or Satsuma not been coming along, it is fairly likely that something would have come after this. If only because, once the genie is out of the bottle, there isn't any putting it back. That's a story as old as time itself when it comes to naval design. So, what was the genesis of this ship, and what was it really about, had it ever been built? Well, as with any story, it starts with a man, Vittorio Cuniberti. A prominent naval officer and ship designer, he had already made a name for himself in his work for the Italian Navy. In particular, his work for the Navy that could be argued as shaping a different type of warship, German Großkreutzer or German battlecruisers as it would turn out. That work was the Regina Elena class battleship, the pre-dreadnought that went faster than dreadnought herself in spite of using reciprocating propulsion. I covered this way back when in my German battlecruiser videos. Kaiser Wilhelm was enamored with the Regina Elenas, in particular their combination of speed and firepower. It wasn't the only thing here, but it did in part shape his desire for a fast battleship, which, through compromise with Tirpitz, eventually came about with the Großkreutzer. In any event, Cuniberti would springboard from this towards pushing a more advanced design. At first, as one could probably expect, he would try to interest the Italian Navy, the Regia Marina, in his designs and ideas. He was Italian, he had already worked with the Navy, so it only made sense. And the Italians, for their part, did quite like the Elenas. However, the great bane of Italian military construction reared its head once more: the lack of money. The budget simply wasn't there for such a radically different ship, certainly not in Italy. Even if it had been there, the Italians didn't see it as necessary. Now, to his credit, Cuniberti did realize this. His later article would state that only the richest of navies could afford such a warship, It should come as little surprise that the article in Jane's fighting ships would put so much focus on the Royal Navy. This article, published in 1903, came about because of the Italian refusal. Well, the refusal to build Cuniberti's idea. The Italian Navy did allow him to publish his concept when they could have refused for national security reasons. This article would feature the latest iteration of Cuniberti's hypothetical all-big gun battleship, something that had begun before the Elena class and had now evolved into its final form. The ship in question was, in many respects, an anachronistic mix of different design features. The all-big gun layout that would become standard, mated to a layout of turrets that strikes one as inefficient at best. Though for 1903, it was not quite as obsolescent as it may seem. It would have been quite similar to various semi-dreadnoughts. And just by having more 12-inch guns, well, it would have been quite superior, in theory, to existing pre-dreadnoughts. Though certainly not as good as Dreadnought or South Carolina would turn out. Although, much like Dreadnought herself, the ship would have no notable secondary battery, save for some light anti-torpedo boat guns, and a very minimalistic superstructure as well. Cuniberti wanted to limit exposure to enemy fire, so the bridge and the conning tower are about it, along with the funnels and 2 simple pole masts. Regardless, Cuniberti was on the right track. His ship was designed, or at least the article laid out a design, with 12 12-inch guns. He insisted on the ship being faster than any existing battleship. Moreover, it was to have 12 inches of armor on both the belt and the turrets, with all of these features being steps forward taken in isolation. In practice, it is very debatable if the technology of 1903 was up to that task. Dreadnought, a larger ship in most dimensions, was slower and carried 2 fewer guns, even with her turbine power plant. Let's look at what the Italian designer was proposing, and you'll see what I mean. Cuniberti, and this is direct from his article, wanted the ship to have, in order, 12 12-inch guns, 12 12-pounder guns, a 12-inch belt that stretched the entire length of the ship, and a speed of at least 24 knots, as if all the rest wasn't enough. This is more guns and more armor than any first-generation dreadnought. Satsuma reached 9 inches. Dreadnought had 11, and South Carolina was 12 inches. None of them had that cover the entire ship. Moreover, the heaviest armed ship, Dreadnought, had only 10 12-inch guns. And did I mention that all of this was supposed to be on only 17,000 tons? This is, for the record, a couple thousand tons less than the full load on Dreadnought, which for reference was around 20,700 tons. On that tonnage, Dreadnought had less armor, 2 less 12-inch guns, and a speed of 21 knots. The Ideal Battleship was slightly shorter than Dreadnought while having the exact same beam. As anyone who knows naval engineering can tell you, the shape of a ship is every bit as important to speed as the power provided. For reference, Cuniberti projected a length of 521.5 feet, 159 meters, and a beam of 82 feet, 25 meters. Dreadnought was 527 feet, 160.6 meters long, and had a beam of 82 feet. I find it very difficult to imagine a ship like this reaching 24 knots. Compare and contrast to Invincible, which did go 25 knots on a longer hull with a slimmer beam, 567 feet long with a beam of 78 feet. However, in the end, Cuniberti's ideal battleship, his invincible Colossus, would never be built, nor would the 6 such ships he suggested as an ideal fleet. Considering the promises placed on it, this was probably a good thing. It would have been nearly impossible to build a ship with these specifications on the tonnage and dimensions suggested. And as Dreadnought did near enough everything this ship could do on a much more logical layout, it can be said navies dodged a bullet in focusing on their own designs. The Italian Dante Alighieri, the Japanese Satsuma, or at least the original design thereof, the American South Carolina, or the German Nassau, or the Russian Gongut, the French Corbeil, and of course Dreadnought. All of these ships do owe something to Cuniberti's design, if only the way it pushed things forward into the public eye. But it is hard to imagine that any of these nations would have been better off building the ideal battleship. All of this being said, however, Cuniberti was fully aware of this. His design was less a design and more a concept to look towards, and in this regard, you can say he succeeded without it ever being built. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.